After an hour, I found on the forest floor the rinds and cores of durian fruit, which I knew was the favorite food of the orangutan. I showed it to the Dayak who had come with me, and he confirmed what I had hoped. The way in which it had been chewed showed that it had been eaten by an orangutan. One must have been here early this morning. We looked up to see where the fruit had come from. And there, 50 feet above us, we saw a nest. Did one sleep there, I asked. Yes, he said, one was there last night. So the trail must still be warm, and the ape was probably quite close. A few minutes later, we heard a crashing in the branches ahead. And there, only a few yards away, we spotted a great furry red form swaying in the trees. Far from being frightened of our presence, he showed little inclination to dash away through the trees, but just hung there, screaming and breaking off branches to throw down at us. Being newly caught, the ape crouched in the corner of his cage and, very understandably, tried to bite anyone who went to touch him. And I decided that we had better leave him for a little while to let him settle down. In any case, by now we had got together such a large collection of animals, parrots, squirrels, and many other creatures, that feeding and cleaning them was more than a full-time job. But it wasn't long before Charlie, as we'd christened him, began to calm down. Slowly, we managed to win his confidence, and soon, every time I passed his cage, he stretched out his hand to attract my attention in the hope that he'd get some more food. When I put my hand in his cage on the third day, he no longer snarled and scratched. So, with some condensed milk on the handle of a spoon, I decided to try and lure him a little way out of his cage. To begin with, he was a bit irritated at not being given his food directly. Then I decided to trust him sufficiently to put my finger right in his mouth. I couldn't let him have the tin in case he might cut himself on the sharp edges. And then, for the first time, 4 days after we'd had him, we encouraged him to come right outside his cage. To begin with, I was a bit nervous because we were traveling downriver and I wasn't sure what sort of chaos he was going to create among all the equipment and cages of animals that was on the ship's deck. Within a few days, he was so tame that he allowed me to put ointment on the bad graze which he had on his wrist. In the early evening, without warning, 2 men walked down the gallery and began to beat on the huge drums. Soon, a dancer, wearing a headdress of hornbill feathers, emerged from beneath the longhouse and began to prance and posture to the music of the drums and gongs which came echoing from the longhouse. Another masked figure came out to join him. And then, watched by the entire village from the gallery of the longhouse, a whole troop of men came out to dance around a newly erected totem pole. I started the nightly chore of feeding and cleaning our collection of animals, when a Dayak called to me from the bank. "Hey, Tuan," he said, "I've got a berouin. Are you interested?" Well, I didn't know what a berouin was, but I said we were very interested, and I asked him to come on board to show it to me. And berouin turned out to be the Malay word for a bear. The Dayak said that early that morning he had found this youngster deserted in the forest, and he had heard that we had wanted animals, so he had brought it in to us. I offered to trade him for cakes of salt, which up here in extremely short supply and very valuable. He asked for 15, and I suggested 10, and we agreed on that. The little cub was obviously very young. I reckoned about 2 weeks old. He seemed to be in good condition, but he hadn't got any teeth and obviously was still feeding on milk. We had got a baby's bottle on board, ready for such a case as this, but I wondered whether he was yet old enough for us to be able to rear him. First, however, he had to be put in a box and covered up so that he kept warm. As soon as the sun went down, it gets quite cold on that river, and we didn't want to risk our new pet catching a chill. And then I had to set about the urgent job of making a bottle of dilute condensed milk. Urgent because the little cub was already calling very loudly indeed for his food. The milk seemed to be about the right temperature. And to my relief, the young cub was soon guzzling away contentedly. If you sit down, keep quiet, and are patient, then animals will soon appear. These are among the loveliest and are certainly the most agile of all the forest animals, the acrobatic gibbons. It was early in the morning, just after dawn, and the gibbons were out looking for breakfast. Some fruit, flowers, or maybe a few birds' eggs. We kept absolutely quiet, and they didn't notice us, but hung a few yards away, eating in the treetops. But soon, one spotted us, and he raised the alarm. And then, with amazing speed and agility, the whole troop leapt away through the branches. These are macaque monkeys, the kind that in Sumatra and Java are sometimes trained to clamber up palm trees and gather coconuts for their masters. These Balinese ones, however, seem to regard things the other way around. It's us who have to provide food for them. When they are grooming one another, they're not simply looking for fleas, but are searching one another's skin for tasty little grains of salt. Although these monkeys look charming and sweet, scampering over the temple carvings, they're really quite a savage lot, ruled over very harshly by one old male. There was no sharing of the grains of maize I offered them, and often they would fight and squabble over them. As a result, the older and bigger ones got far more than their fair share. I tried hard to give these little babies some food, but always the adults snatched it from my hand. And once a baby did manage to grab a grain, its mother wrenched open its jaws, extracted the maize, and ate it herself. I discovered that the temple was sacred to the cave's inhabitants. Bats. During the day, they blanketed the roof of their cave, squawking and squabbling. But at nightfall, they will all fly out to hawk through the air in the dusk in search of insects. The shrines beneath them were heavily encrusted with bat droppings, and the ground of the cave was crawling with cockroaches. Inside it was hot with the warmth of the bats' bodies, and all the time there was a steady hail of lice and droppings, and once as I passed, a dead bat flopped onto the floor. I ventured inside and found on a ledge at the back this large python. It had dwelt in the back of the cave for many years, living off the dead bats as they dropped from the roof. Not far from the cave, we found a colony of a different sort of bats, the giant fruit bat or flying fox. They were hanging upside down from the top of the trees, fanning themselves in the midday sun. I clapped, and the entire colony took to flight. Now comes the barong's main antagonist, heralded by two attendants. Rangda, the dreaded evil witch. The barong approaches her And now begins the fight. The men from the village, in a state of trance, rush down from the temple, waving their swords to attack Rangda and protect the barong. But Rangda, by her evil power, is able to hold them at bay. Suddenly, with a flourish of her magic cloth, she forces them to turn their daggers upon themselves. The men, almost insensible, try to thrust these sharp swords into their chests. But the barong's power is stronger than Rangda's, and he is able to protect his followers so that their swords do not pierce the flesh and no blood is shed. Now the priest comes from the temple and scatters holy water to bring the men out of their trances. The men rush back into the temple. The barong disappears, and all that is left are the mangy curs eating the priest's offerings to the gods. The bait lay in a dry riverbed in front of us. We waited, but not for long. Within half an hour there was a rustle in the bush, and there was the dragon. This was tremendously exciting for us, our first sight of this magnificent monster, the climax of 4 months of arduous travel. He was enormous. I reckoned about 10 feet long. As he circled us, flicking out his great yellow tongue, savouring the smell of the goat's flesh, he looked almost as though he had walked out of some prehistoric age. There was a noise from the direction of the bait, and another dragon, this time a much smaller young one, had come to begin investigating the bait. The big one joins him. And he begins tearing and ripping at the goat's carcass. That is the leg of a full-grown goat that he's tugging at, so you can judge his size for yourself. They're trying to drag them away back to their lairs, but we've tied the bait with rope onto a stake, so they have to eat it here. We were so close to him that we could see every scale in his hoary black skin. Now we had proof that the dragons were indeed here, so before they ate too much of the bait, we shouted and waved to scare them away. Not being able to get inside to the smell which was attracting him, he came round to the front. But now he caught a whiff of the smell of the suspended bait. I hadn't reckoned on him being so big, and to our dismay we saw that he could reach this hanging bait. But fortunately, he couldn't get enough to satisfy him, and he retreated with some of the goat's intestines dangling from the corner of his mouth. And down came the door. Hastily, we piled boulders on the door so that he couldn't lift it up. We had got him. And we thought our troubles were over. We had filmed him and we had caught him. But we reckoned without one thing. Unfortunately, in the end, bureaucracy defeated us and we weren't given a permit to export those dragons from Indonesia. So I'm afraid they're still there. That was the end of our zoo quest. They were all emphatic that their particular part of the jungle was teeming with wildlife, and that if that was all we wanted, well, we should go no further. But no one seemed to be able to explain exactly what animals were to be found, until one old man said, "Oh, yes, Tuan, many animals in this place, very good place for animals. Why, only 2 weeks ago," he said, "a tiger came into this very kampong and ate 2 men. This is a fine place for animals." Well, I explained hastily that man-eating tigers were not actually on our list of desirable animals to be caught. And as no one seemed anxious to volunteer for the task of catching the tiger, we let the subject drop. We talked for a little time more, and then one man said that when he had been in the forest a few days ago, he had seen a very large snake in one of the trees. Maybe, he said, it's still there. Well, that sounded much more manageable to me, and the next day, with him as a guide, we set off to look for it. And sure enough, we found it. It looked enormous, and from its size and markings, I was quite sure that it was a python, and therefore non-poisonous, which was something of a relief. It's important to grab his tail as soon as you grab his head, otherwise he'll wrap his great coils round you and give you a very nasty squeeze. As he climbed the tree, we saw that he was feeding. His long, sticky tongue flickering over the branches, gathering the ants, which swarmed everywhere. Not a particularly pleasant meal, one would have thought, but at least his hard, scaly coat protects him from the worst of his stings. Without a regular daily supply of live ants, the pangolin can't live. We couldn't hope to provide him with the right sort of ants in London, so we didn't try to catch him, but just sat quietly and watched him as he continued undisturbed with his morning meal. We noticed that the ants on which the pangolin was feeding had constructed nests for themselves by fastening together clusters of leaves. There seemed to be a great deal of activity going on around these nests, so we looked closer. At first, we couldn't distinguish exactly what the ants were doing as they bustled about so busily. However, then we noticed this group with their jaws locked tight in the lower leaf and their hind legs attached to the upper leaf. The colony is constructing a new nest, and these patient workers are holding 2 leaves of the future nest in position so that other members can fasten them together to form the outer wall of their new home.